Caddis Maximus here. This time we have wire and cable shears that we're reviewing and comparing. And we have a few different brands and styles here, plus some unique ones, which I'll call the alternate or specialty shears. And yes, these are a separate class of cutting tools than many of the other cutting tools that I've shown. And I also include these in their own class versus pinch type or side cutters. That would be cutters more like these. These types of cutters are commonly used by linemen, people who work with electrical cable, as well as people who work with heavier duty cable and even steel strapping. Now the reason these are really nice to have and actually are a big deal is these types of cutters really make nice, round, and very clean cuts in the ends of wire, which is very important because when you're using side cutters, that ends up really squashing the wire. And if you're just doing household wiring, it's not really a big deal. But it starts to be a much bigger deal if you're cutting larger diameter cables for, heavy power or car audio, those type of situations. And these are also great for cutting any type of soft material. And we have a few different brands, some Soman, Klein, some Picos, which they don't label, etc. We even have some, actually, these are pet nail clippers, but they actually work great as wire cutters. I really do like them quite a bit. Now, these are also really nice for tubing or any kind of, I think I just mentioned the soft material, but it's amazing how well they work on soft material. You just get these perfectly clean little cuts. Let's go ahead and take a closer look at some of these, look at some of the different design styles. I have a few different design styles. So here's some Kleins. These are some really nice heavy duty. These are forged tool steel, and then they're ground to have two really flat surfaces, and then they of course put them together. Now the deal with these types of cutters, as you can see, is they're ground very sharp. These are not for cutting steel wire at all. I've seen lots of pairs of these used, and inevitably somebody's tried to cut some type of steel wire and just makes a nasty notch in the sharp edge of these jaws. So these are for aluminum, copper, and soft metals only. So many times people use these in a pinch for cutting some type of steel wire. Even steel tie wire will ding up the edges of these blades, basically ruining them, because the whole point of them is to make a nice clean cut. And let's just demonstrate that with the Kleins. We have some coaxial video cable, and when we cut with these, first, they're super easy to cut with because they're so sharp. And we can see that we get a pretty decent cut. It's squashed a little bit, but very little. If we were to compare that, say these are side cutters, the same thing in linesman's pliers, but when you use linesman's pliers, especially on a cable like this, first, it's not as easy to cut because it's just squashing it and separating it. And then you can see how badly it actually flattens and just squishes the conductor in there. And that's why you want to use cutters like these. That sharp edge starts to make a real difference when you're working with heavy gauge cable, because it makes it a whole lot easier. And of course there's larger versions. I have a video maybe 20 or 30 videos ago where I did large cutters, where I showed the difference between bolt cutters, heavy duty wire cutters, as well as heavy duty cable cutters like these like these Felcos here. And another distinction of these cutters is they always kind of draw inwards, and you can see how they cut because they trap the wire in this pinch point, and then that point draws closed evenly. There are some different design styles. These are Samoans, and these are really nice. They have a slightly different design where they snip and then they kind of draw in from the front side, drawing really close to the jaw, and then they kind of snip it off, the rest off at once. These have always been much easier to use for me just because they have, if we line up the center pivot point to these Kleins, we can see the jaw is almost half as long, half the distance, yet the handles are easily just as long or even a little bit longer. So these Samoans have always been super easy. If I were to cut cable like these, it's basically no effort whatsoever. There we go. And we can see that the way they still squish is still not so bad because they hardly put any side pressure onto the wire, and they actually slice right through it. So it really is just a nice deal. And I wanted to generally talk about these Samoans because I think they're the higher quality unit. The only takeaway from them is the handles are a bit far apart. You really need like 2 hands to get them onto the edge of the wire before you actually are able to crimp, but they have really nice wide flared handles. They're extremely heavy duty. And so that was the point of those. Here's some Picos, which are, I would say, a mid-range brand, and they're actually pretty nice as well. One thing I really appreciate about these Picos is they actually have they're of 2 of those round shearing type cutters integrated into one unit. We have a large one in the base of it, which of course works excellent. And then we have a smaller one right up front, and I thought that was handy. Sometimes I've used that on real fine stranded wire, and I always kind of appreciate the difference in design. The only thing that it does, I have had an issue with, is if you're cutting large wires with these, sometimes those front jaws catch. It's really not a big deal. It still cuts it just fine, but sometimes it makes it just a little bit weird. But I did appreciate the attempt to make one that had 2 different cutters in one. One thing I also wanted to mention is you do want to try to keep these cutters oiled. Once rust starts building up on the ground surfaces, it kind of acts as an abrasive. Even though you don't open and close them much, these are a tool that you really want to try to prevent rust from affecting. These would be a cheaper pair. I think these are Ideals, or these are similar to Ideals or Garber Bender, like budget ones, and they're just hardened plate steel that just are ground with that hemisphere shape. And you can see these, they just put the grinding all the way up. I mean, way larger than was necessary. But once again, all these cutters are just excellent. When you're using them, you just get perfect little shaves every single time. And so I always recommend having a set of these because of just how well they work. You can take and cut a wire and it isn't squashed, and you're just ready to immediately put it into a terminal. And that's always been the issue I had with side cutters. And then if you're cutting heavier duty wire or thicker wire, you're just putting an enormous amount of pressure on side cutters just trying to cut it, because you're really just squashing it apart, rather than these, which are actually 2 knives coming past each other, actually slicing the cable. And so that would be just a quick comparison of different styles of I would say wire and heavy duty wire shears. Now we have a few other pairs of more unique shears over here, and I didn't know what other review to include these on, but since they're tools that work in a shearing action, blades moving past each other, I decided to include them here. The first one is a pretty neat little tool. This is a Signode 3/4 inch strap cutter, Model 2. And this is a pretty nice little tool. I only paid $5. When I looked at it, I thought, wow, this is pretty well made, considering you can see that wide flashing. It's actually a forged steel tool. And so everything that is shipped that is any kind of weight has either synthetic or steel strapping. And usually, you know, if any kind of construction supplies are held together with steel strapping. And, you know, it's very difficult to cut them with side cutters. So you're always cutting them with some kind of tool. And it always seems that nobody ever has really the proper tool. Most of the times it's just aviation or tin snips that people are cutting those with. But what's neat is there's actually a specialty tool that's really designed to cut those, to make it nice and easy, and even a safer operation, because your hand's far further away from those metal straps. A lot of times they'll have a lot of tension. When they cut, they want to snap out. And if your hand's right here on some tin snips versus back here on these, it can make a big difference. And they really work well. They have a progressive design, and you can see they just make a absolutely beautiful cut. It's really surprising. And you can see it's just a tapered jaw, so when you start cutting, it grabs onto the back and progressively goes forward. What's nice about at least the moving jaw is it can be flipped over and you have a whole nother cutting edge. So I like that aspect of it. And it's just very heavy duty, very well built, and it's one of the reasons it works so well is because of how well built it is. It also has one of the rare springs, which is these coiled sheet metal springs that you do need to keep oiled, but I've always had great luck with those springs. They always seem to have plenty of range and actually quite a bit of tension, but they're also a lot more expensive. So I just wanted to show this type of cutter. It's really great when you're cutting small cross sections of sheet metal, and obviously as its intended purpose as a strap cutter. Once you have one of those tools for cutting straps, you pretty much use it every single time. It just makes it so simple and easy. Now we have another set of cutter channel locks, which are apparently not made anymore, and they're kind of hard to find. I've searched around. There are actually some forum posts. There's a little following. A lot of people kind of like these channel lock. These are ChannelLock 308s. And the difference is these are like stub nose shears. And I didn't really know exactly what these are specifically intended for because there isn't any manufacturer information on what exactly these were called or what they're intended for, but what they seem like is basically very small, smooth jaw tin snips. And that's essentially what I've used them for. If you want to know the truth, I mean, they cut sheet metal like this galvanized sheet metal just excellent. And to tell you the truth, when I had got these, I actually ended up getting the strap shears about a month later, but these are what I had been using to cut metal straps was these ChannelLock 308s, and they've always worked out real nice for me. But I just wanted to point out that they do make kind of like sheet metal or tin snips that are like this, where they're just a really high leverage version of a sheet metal shear. And I also wanted to put that out there because there may be some other people who are aware of the ChannelLock 308s and what their kind of intended purpose was. The last thing we're going to get into is these Swiss-made Felcos. And these are the Felco C7s. Actually, in this light, you can just make out Felco. Felco is a Swiss-made brand. There's rust all over this tool, but somehow it didn't touch where it said Swiss-made, and I always thought that was amusing. And it also has another one of those coiled spiral sheet metal springs that you do have to oil, but they're a really nice piece. They give you just a huge amount of range and a really nice steady amount of tension over the entire range or working length. Felcos have always been nice because they have asymmetrical handles. You can see this certain curve for the part that sits on your hand, and a second type with a little hook or shape on the lower where your fingers go. And so I always appreciate that attention to detail. Really nice locking. It's really secure because it actually hooks upwards into the jaw, so it's a real secure locking mechanism. And because of the way it hooks, they don't have to have a lot of tension, so it's really easy to just move back and forth. These types of cutters are commonly known as bicycle spoke cutters. Many different terms that people use for these types of cutters, and inevitably whenever they say I have a pair and show me, they look similar to one of these, which are just simply heavy-duty cutters for hardened steel cable. If you're cutting steel cable, bicycle spokes, piano wire, these are the type of cutters you really want to use. Side cutters like these are great for general cutting use, but when you start cutting very hard steels, even welding wire, you end up notching and getting little circles in the side cutters. And it's surprising, but there are cutters made that will last longer when you're cutting very hard materials. The second thing is when you're cutting steel cable, the little strands really want to get jammed up. Steel cable is one of those things that is difficult to cut if you don't have a special set of shears like these. And the obvious design of these is you have pretty long handle and just a super stubby, super short head. And you wonder, why is the head so stubby and short? It's just because you need that kind of leverage, one. And two, the cutting surface basically needs to be as close to the bolt or whatever pin is locking the two jaws together as possible, so that they don't have any chance of wanting to splay apart, that they really force themselves past the wire. We have a little piece of steel cable right here, as a matter of fact. Now, this is not piano wire, but this is some stainless steel wire, and it's actually fairly large in diameter, I'd have to say, right around 1/8 of an inch. And trying to cut something like this with side cutters would just be, you could do it, but it'd be a real rough cut. You'd have like this squash, real sharp edge, kind of splayed wires, and you would have to almost put those side cutters in a vise. And when you're using Felcos turn this into a completely different situation where you have this piece of cable and you just need to cut it. And what's interesting about cutting steel cable is that you have to put a bit of force to begin the cut, and then once it starts to shear, it just goes right through, just like a kind of a sudden release. Once you get enough pressure to start the cut, it just suddenly goes down. You can see that it didn't just totally destroy the cable. If we look at this end here, it might be a little bit easier. Come on, camera. There we go. You can see that the end of the cable is a really nice, smooth cut. You could easily slide a ferro rule or something over that. And so that's the big deal about actually getting cutters that are designed for cutting steel cable and hardened wires. They actually make a nice cut. You're not struggling with it, and it's not destroying the tool every time you're trying to cut something. I can guarantee you, even with the stainless steel wire, you're not going to get a lot of cycles out of these channel locks until you start getting dings in the jaws, and once that happens, they won't cut at all. They're basically over with. Everybody knows how frustrating it is to have a set of side cutters or end nips that have notches in the jaws. They just become useless, and that's what's nice about having a set of cutters specifically for those more heavy-duty operations. So anyway, that just about finishes it up with this review and comparison of various different types of wire and cable shears. And one last note, if you were to try to use one of these specific copper wire shears with this cable, it would instantly and permanently destroy them. This would just rip apart the sharp edge, would fold under there. Literally, you could destroy a pair of these wire and cable shears just trying to cut steel cable. And I did want to put that out there. So it's kind of a real informative things that cutters like these that seem very heavy duty but have a real sharp edge are just so that they can get through thick cross sections of copper and aluminum wire without you having to stand on them, and to make a clean cut, which is important in the termination of wire. Otherwise, if you're doing heavier duty cutting, there's heavier duty cutters, and I would certainly recommend buying a pair, because you'll end up spending more money ruining a tool, replacing the tool that you ruined, and then buying a proper tool instead of actually just buying the proper tool in the first place. Even if it's a Harbor Freight, go to Harbor Freight and pick one up. And it's also time is money, so you can get a nice tool and use it inappropriately and get a warranty replacement, but you still have to spend a bunch of time dealing with the warranty replacement, and you may or may not have even successfully completed your project. So anyway, that was another Catus Maximus video, review and comparison. I really appreciate everybody watching and subscribing, and if you haven't subscribed, please do subscribe. Until next time, Catus Maximus out.